Years ago, when I was a Russian historian, my mother said to me, "Ronald, don't get mixed up with the Armenians." And I sort of took that advice, but two people are responsible for dragging me into Armenian studies. One was my teacher at Columbia, Nina Garsoyan, who was incomparable medievalist, wonderful woman, taught me how to do good research. Tried to teach me Armenian, though her Russian is better than Armenian, but I'm still working on that. And the fellow that's going to talk to us today, Richard Hovannisian. Richard is, without doubt, the pioneer in modern Armenian studies, the person who first really established the study of Armenian history from its earlier, I would say, narcissistic and nationalistic beginnings into something more scientific, more objective, bringing it up really to world levels. His magnum opus was, I would call it, a 4-volume study of the Armenian Republic. First volume, Armenia on the Road to Independence, and then 3 massive volumes on the Republic itself. More pages about the Republic than there actually were days of that Republic. So this is an encyclopedic work which is absolutely indispensable for those of us who don't want to go through these archives and find things. We can use them, exploit them, and we've been doing that. And some years ago, after many, many volumes, edited volumes, and articles on the Armenian genocide and modern Armenian history, a 2-volume history of Armenia, which is still the standard work on the subject, which means that it is bitterly attacked by many people, both in the diaspora and in Hayastan in Armenia itself. Richard said something like to me, I remember once, that he was about to retire. For him, retirement meant that he was going to begin collecting, organizing conferences on various cities, regions of historic Armenia, and publish a series of volumes, the latest of which is the volume on Izmir, Smyrna, 2 copies of which are available if you're careful and would like to purchase them afterwards. And that's what Richard is going to talk to us today. So this is a person who has opened the way for younger generations, and even though I decided I wasn't going to be in Armenian studies, I'm happy for his introduction into the field.
Thank you.
Richard.
Thank you.
Richard Hovannisian.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you, Ron. As Professor Suni mentioned, the beginning of this century, I suppose, I realized that much of the connections between Armenian generations of generations born abroad after the genocide and expulsion of the Armenians, the link was getting weaker and weaker. Our parents' generation, grandparents' generation could all remember every street, every river, every stream. And because we were losing so much, I decided to start this series of, on the historic Armenian provinces and cities. And most of them relate to, let me see if I can get this up. No, I don't. Didn't know how to do that. Is this a pointer? Here.
Yeah.
Most of what I have done relates to this area here, which is the Armenian highland that borders on the Russian Empire, on Iran, and where the Armenian nation had been formed and existed for more than 3,000 years before 1915 and its destruction in the Ottoman Empire. So after I did the conferences on Van, on Bitlis, on Harpert, Mush, Sepastia or Sivas, and Erzurum, and so forth, I looked at elsewhere where there are very large Armenian communities that are that were never in the historical Armenian country, within the boundaries of historical Armenia. One of those areas was Cappadocia, which is right next to the Armenian highland. And actually, after I did this volume on Izmir, I have now published this volume on Kayseri, or Gesaria. And here there were about 70,000 Armenians living in this area. So what I decided is to do these not secondary, but external regions, and sometimes they were more important economically and culturally than the provinces in the east, because they had more exposure to the outside world. For example, here in Istanbul or Constantinople, the largest Armenian community of the entire Ottoman Empire. No longer was there a huge population of 100,000 or more in any of these cities, but here in Istanbul in the beginning of the 20th century, between 100 and 200,000 with its suburbs. So it was the most important intellectual and cultural and administrative center of the Armenian community with its patriarch here. The second largest city in the Ottoman Empire was Izmir, known to the Greeks and Armenians as Smyrna, which probably had more import-export than even Constantinople, and so it was the most important port city. And you can see this very natural bay here, or gulf, where it takes you into the Mediterranean Sea. And I looked at, decided that after having done this and this, that I would focus on this city. Most of my conferences deal with the whole province, but this volume that is in the back focuses only on one city, and that's the city of Smyrna, because it's so critical in modern Armenian history. The numbers are not critical. There were never more than 25,000 Armenians living in this city, which was overwhelmingly Greek in its population and in its economy. The Greek, the Turks call this frequently the Gyavur city, meaning the infidel city, because of the Christian majority in Smyrna. But the Armenians were 25,000 and played a very important role, and they spread out all these agricultural communities around. And they were important because in modern Armenian history, there was a 18th, 19th century movement that is referred to as Zartonk, which means a renaissance. And the Renaissance was an intellectual, cultural renaissance. And like other people, the Renaissance doesn't begin in the homeland. The Renaissance begins outside. It begins in Venice or in Madras, India, or in Constantinople or in Smyrna. And here they start being influenced by external social, economic, and political occurrence. And from once they've absorbed them, then they gradually penetrate eastward into the Armenian highland itself. These two cities, Constantinople and Smyrna, in the Zartonk, in the Armenian cultural renaissance, were critical because there was in the 19th century a long and bitter battle between the classicists who wanted to maintain the purity of the classical Armenian language in discourse or in literature, much as there were those who wanted to keep Latin as the purest language of Europe. And then there were the reformers who believed that language and literature should be utilitarian, should have a purpose. And therefore, they wanted their people to be able to read and understand what they had to say, particularly in the age of newspapers. And so there was this long struggle between the classicists and the reformers, and the Armenian intellectuals of Constantinople and Smyrna were the most important in fashioning the modern Western Armenian dialect that is still being used and written today. After a long struggle, they became successful. As I say, they're utilitarians, people influenced by Western thought and writers. And almost all of them, not all of them, but here in Smyrna at least, almost every one of them being a newspaper editor and a teacher at the same time. So this is the city I want to focus on. Smyrna is exceptional in 1915, when the rest of the Armenian population was being deported and massacred throughout Asia Minor and throughout the Armenian highland, being pushed southward toward the Syrian deserts where ISIS is today. Smyrna was spared. This city, along with one or two others, was not deported. Some people would say because the Vali, or the governor, although being a part of the ruling party, the Young Turk Party, was pro-British and didn't approve of the policies of the government. Others say it's because the German commander here, you know, the Germans were the allies of the British, of the Turks in World War I. And German commanders were everywhere, German soldiers were everywhere. They witnessed the Armenian genocide, and a few of them actually participated in it. But here the general was dead set against the deportations. I'm not sure of the reason. Maybe also because it was an international center with hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign merchants and diplomats and consuls, but Smyrna was not deported. And so the people of Smyrna, the Armenians of Smyrna, these 25,000 people, went on with their lives during World War I, when the rest of the Armenian world was in turmoil. And when the war ended in 1918, this year is the beginning of World War I. It lasted for 4 years. And when the war ended in 1918, these people felt like they were free, home free. The Turkish Empire had been defeated. The Allied powers had been victorious. The Allied powers had made numerous promises and pledges regarding the restitution and restoration of the Armenian people. In any case, they felt that they had been spared. They didn't realize that their turn was going to come only 7 years later, in 1922, in September 1922, when the Turkish armies of the Turkish nationalist movement, led by the heroic figure of modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal, was able to organize a resistance, a Turkish resistance, to the Sultan's government here and to the Allied powers who tried to impose a severe treaty. And in that story, the Allies were instrumental in allowing the Greek army to occupy Smyrna in May of 1919. Not annex it, but occupy it, with the probability that eventually Smyrna would be united with Greece. This is, after all, the ancient land of the Greeks, and the Greek prime minister, whose name was Venizelos, had this idea of a megalo-Greece, recreating a Greek empire, and he was supported by the British prime minister, whose name was David Lloyd George. Lloyd George was very much taken by Venizelos, was all sympathetic to the Greek occupation of Smyrna. That occupation of May 1919 really helped to organize the resistance of Turkish nationalists who resented and opposed this. It sort of crystallized under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal. In 1920, the Allied powers, because they were very concerned about the rise of the Turkish nationalist movement, and Kemal, who wanted to overthrow the treaties that the Allies were intending to impose on Turkey, authorized the Greek army to advance, to engage Mustafa Kemal. They were not willing to do so. They would not commit any troops or resources, but they wanted the Greek army to go eastward and to knock Mustafa Kemal out. Mustafa Kemal was here in Ankara, and the Greek army was very successful in 1920 in taking one victory after another and approaching a river here which was the gateway to Ankara. The river is known as the Sakarya River, and this went on until 1921, of one victory after another. This was a time in Greece, however, when there was a great deal of internal turmoil. Venizelos was voted out of office. The royalists who were vying for power were successful. There was a great change of military leadership in the Greek army, and this worked to the benefit of the Turkish nationalists of Kemal. And in 1921, the end of 1921, at the Battle of Sakarya, it's like Stalingrad, they were able to make a very valiant stand and turn the tide of battle. And so in 1922, the Greek armies and the civilian population here, the Greek and Armenian civilian population, began their retreat helter-skelter westward. And by September of 1922, they had reached all this area here where thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Christian population had now concentrated along the Aegean Sea. For the Armenians, it was ironic because after World War I in 1918, the survivors who had been deported down to Syrian deserts, thinking that the war was now over, Turkey was defeated, the Allied powers were going to support them, returned to numerous towns and villages in this region of Western Asia Minor, perhaps to 100 towns and villages. The survivors, there was not a large number, but there were a significant number, who now in a second exodus are now fleeing with the Greek population toward the coast. Mustafa Kemal's army approached the outskirts of Izmir in the beginning of September 1922. There was a great deal of panic among the population. The Greek army was in disarray. It went over here to Çeşme, where the Greek Navy, naval vessels took most of the Greek army and were able to rescue them. But the population remained stranded along the seacoast here. There was great fear that another massacre was going to occur when the Turkish army entered the city. This, as I say, was referred to frequently as the infidel city because of the dominance of the Greek element in the city. The marketplace was Greek. You see Greek signs up and down Rue Franck and the major thoroughfares and shopping areas. They had the best seacoast villas, along with the Levantines, these people who were sort of mixture of European and Middle Eastern people who lived along Bella Vista, the seafront. The Turkish army entered into Smyrna on September 9th, 1922. And it was a relief because the army entered in good order. And the Christian population, the thousands upon thousands of refugees who are now in the city and along the seacoast, feel relieved that, well, maybe the Kemalist army will follow military discipline and there will be no retribution. That optimism lasted only 2 days, because on the third day already the Cheta, these irregulars from the outside of Smyrna were in the city, beginning the looting and the killing of the Christian population and Christian quarters. And then the enormous tragedy. On September 13th, 1922, all around the Armenian quarter, Smyrna was divided, let's see if I can see this. Well, this is Mount Pagos, the mountain that backs and the Agora. Let me just go over these. You can see what Smyrna looked like in the 19th, 18th, 19th century. And here you see the European quarter, who are the Levantines, the Greek quarter, the Armenian quarter, the Jewish quarter, and the Turkish quarter. And on the 13th of September, fires were set intentionally all around the Armenian quarter, which began to burn. I'll come back to the question of responsibility. We in California have a condition which is referred to as the Santa Ana winds. The Santa Ana winds are those that blow from the mountains to the sea instead of the wind blowing from the sea inland. And there was such a condition at that time here where the hot winds were blowing from the mountains behind them toward the sea. And so they engulfed first the Armenian quarter and spread down to the Greek quarter and eventually to the European quarter, most of which was destroyed. So virtually all of Christian Smyrna was destroyed in 2 days between September 13th and September 15th, 1922. The Armenians' quarter was known as High Notes. In Armenian, High Notes means a place where Armenians live. And they had here their cathedral of Surp Stepanos, St. Stephen's, around which this prosperous Armenian community existed. The Armenians had come here at least, not so early, but at least since the 13th century. There are documents, commercial documents between the Byzantine rulers and the Genoese that refer to the Armenians of Smyrna in the 13th century. And then in 1375, the last Armenian kingdom on the Mediterranean Sea fell to the Mamluks of Egypt, and thousands of Armenians moved into Smyrna. But most of the Armenians came from the east, from the plain of Ararat, where the little country of Armenia today exists, as a result of the continuous and repetitive wars between the Ottoman Turks and the Persians. Those wars went on in the 16th, 17th centuries that were devastating, followed by bandit groups that are known as Jalalis, who devastated the plain of Ararat and the Arax River Valley. And in that time, thousands of Armenians from the eastern regions of the Armenian Plateau fled westward and found refuge in a number of cities near the sea coast, in Constantinople, and here in Smyrna as well. They very rapidly became prominent as merchants. They, particularly in the silk trade, they were the middlemen along with some Greek and Jewish merchants who dominated the commerce of this city, bringing in the silk from the east, transporting it to the Italian cities, establishing commercial houses in Manchester, England. And when the silk trade declined, they were very resourceful. They converted to exporting cotton and textiles and dried fruit. Interestingly, I grew up in California, in the Central Valley of California, near Fresno. And I remember as a child, we would go to Fresno and there would be mile after mile of fig orchards. And these were the Smyrna figs that Armenian immigrants had brought with them here. And so dried figs from Smyrna were, dried fruit was a major export of these people. So by the 17th century, 18th century, the Armenians had 3 churches in Smyrna. They had some 15 or 20,000 people. More of them came in the 17th and 18th century, those who were Armenian Catholics. Some number of villages in the east, in northern Iran, and in the plain of Ararat had been converted to Catholicism, but they were being persecuted. And to flee the persecution, they came westward to Ankara and various places, including this area, where there was a significant Armenian Catholic Uniate community. Here you see Bella Vista, where the wealthy Levantines, Greeks, and Armenians lived along the quay. The seafront, and I want you to see this seafront because, and imagine, if you can, some 300,000 people in 1922, when the fire began, are pressed into this narrow area that extends about 2 kilometers or 3 kilometers from north to south, with some 300,000 people here, and the fire coming toward them, the heat of the fire coming toward them, and only the sea in front of them. And thousands of them are going to jump into the water to drown or to be killed. Many of them are hanging over, and according to American sailors who have described this, I'm not describing it, the American are, they're witnessing people hanging over the quay having their hands chopped off so that they would fall into the water and perish. This is Rue Franck. You can see in the very front here the Greek writing, and everywhere there is the Greek element. The famous Kramer Hotel, which was, every city has its hotel where dignitaries stay. This is a seafront hotel for the city of Smyrna. The theater where Greek, Armenian, and European drama was put on. And here we see the panorama, the Greek Orthodox Cathedral of St. Fotini. And here you see the Armenian Cathedral of St. Stephen's. A little distance from the sea, but not very far, probably a 5-minute walk from here there. And these are where most of the Armenians live, although they live in a number of other quarters, but this is their central living area. This is the Catholic Church of St. Polycarp. Polycarp was the first bishop of Smyrna, martyred, and the church is still there. And here is the Greek Orthodox Cathedral of St. Fotini. And now we have Hainots. This is the Armenian quarter. You can see the church dominates it, and red tile roof. Roofs are structures and homes. A very prosperous community. It's church. This is a plan, and you can hear a street leading to the Armenian church. You see the cross in the distance of the entrance to the courtyard. And here's the courtyard, the interior of St. Stephen's, the altar. And here are some of the intellectuals. I need not really name them, although this is Chilingirian, Stepan Voskan, Mamurian, Mateos Mamurian, Dedeyan. These people collectively are born in the early 1800s. They all born about the same time, the early 1800s. They all go to the Armenian school, which is right next to the church, known as the Mesropian School. The Mesropian School is opened already in 1775. I mean, that's the time of George Washington. So you can see that it was an enlightened and progressive community that established this school. These were graduates of the Mesropian School, all of whom then went to Europe for higher education, who learned languages, French, English, German, Russian, came back to become teachers in the school itself, principals of the school, and also editors of newspapers. The first Armenian printing press was already working in Smyrna by 1760. And the first Armenian newspapers, a number of them, begin to appear from the 1840s onward. And each of these individuals is a newspaper editor, both in Armenian newspapers and in French language newspapers. They're all reformers. They're not revolutionaries, but they're reformers. They praise evolutionary change, they praise democracy, they criticize sometimes veiled autocracy, and they are critical in the development of the modern language which they begin to employ in their articles and newspapers. Collectively, these four men have translated more than 100, maybe 200 European works into Armenian. There was a great sort of thirst among the educated or educating class for European literature. So they translated the entire repertoire of Shakespeare. They did Voltaire, Molière, Tolstoy, Goethe into Armenian, and it had its own readership. At the same time that they did their own initial original writings in the Armenian language. They believed that literature was critical in reflecting the character of a people and wanted to create an Armenian literature which would reflect what their own image was of who the Armenians should be. This was a Mesropian school that goes back to 1775, right next to the church. And you see this, the students at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, very, very what we would consider European looking, wearing suits and ties, and I sometimes compare them with my students at UCLA who come with torn pants and holes in their shirts and all of that. And look at these, look at them, the students of the Mesropian and the faculty of the Mesropian. Sports. Sports are very important in creating identity, developing identity. And here we have the Mesropian School athletic team. And even to this day, in diasporan life, the youth organizations, whether they're Greek organizations or Armenian or any other, it's the athletic organizations that are frequently used to inculcate at the same time a sense of national identity. And you see this is already at work in Smyrna, which is outside of the historic Armenian highland. Here we see the science class, the senior class of science. And then in 1840, the girls' school, high school was established, named for Haripsime. And this Haripsime school is 1840, at a time when female education was not widespread. Again, indicating the progressive nature of this community. And here you see the students of the Haripsime school and the faculty. The girls, graduates, this woman has a tragic story. She's the headmistress because in 1914 she went with her husband to visit his family in the historic region of Sepastia, known as Sivas now. And that was the time of the deportations and massacres. She was carried away with the deportations and died during those deportations in 1915, and just by coincidence happened to be there when her own city in Smyrna was one of those cities that had been spared. The Armenian Catholics. The Catholics are they have an Armenian Catholic order that's known as the Mokhitaris. The Mokhitaris had a very large school, very active community in Smyrna, and you see the Armenian priests and their students of the time. And again, football teams for the athletic. Armenian Boy Scouts already. And the American college, secondary school, that was attended largely by Greeks and Armenians, although it was open to everyone. And dried figs, as you can see here at the Almasian fig factory in Smyrna, Janik Almasian fig factory. You can see how many people are employed in this factory. As I say, the silk trade declined, and so they found other means to create wealth. These are Smyrna items in an Armenian museum in Watertown, Massachusetts. This was the mansion of the Izmir. It's outside of Hainots. It's outside the Armenian quarter, right on the sea. This was a very wealthy man who in 1920 was appointed as the honorary consul general of the Republic of Armenia, which Professor Suni mentioned, but of course it didn't materialize. It's now been converted to a Turkish girls' school on the outskirts of Smyrna. Around the city, there were many neighborhoods where Armenians lived. Here you see up on the hill the Armenian church of Surp Garabed, St. John the Precursor in Karakhach. And the Vartanian school in Turkey today, former Armenian institutions that usually are standing because they're being used for a purpose, and that's good. In this case, it's being used as a city museum for Karakhach, and the Vartanian school is, as you can see, is the museum. This was the Armenian school with their students, and around you can see where it says Izmir. If you look at a big arch around it, to the north you'll see Menemen, Manisa, Turgutlu. Turgutlu used to be known as Kasaba. And because this, you have here at University of Michigan chairs that are named for Manugyan, I believe, right? This is the birthplace of Alex Manugyan, the, where do I put? I'm sorry, where is Turgut? Here. This is the birthplace of Alex Manugyan, who later came to the United States and, as you know, did the Masco institution here in Greater Detroit, right? And all around are Armenian communities. This is Manisa. Many of the Armenians from Manisa came from where my family originated, in the region of Harput, or Harpert, and interestingly, maintained their dialect for a very long time. Even among the some other villages, they were still speaking, after 300 years of having moved to the west, were still speaking an Eastern Armenian dialect of Karabakh or the Arax River Valley. So it's interesting how language was sort of insulated and preserved in these communities down through the centuries. This is known as the town of Kirkakhach. The Armenian, I had never even heard of Kirkakhach when I started this series, but you could see everywhere that where there was a significant Armenian community, not even significant, small Armenian community, they created their church and their school. Even if the school had 20 or 30 students, they created and maintained a school, and it was not easy to do that. For any of you who tries to maintain a church or a school in this country will know that it takes enormous effort, and yet that's what they were doing. Here are the students of the Kirkakhach. This is, let me think about it, Udimish. Again, a significant Armenian. Here, agricultural. The choir of Udimish and the football teams of Smyrna, and the Armenian football teams of Smyrna and Udimish here. They're taking Udimish is about 4 hours journey from Smyrna, and here we have the team posing for a picture, I would say before the game, because it certainly couldn't be after the game, right? All right. Again, the students and faculty, I do this so you can see that this was a very advanced region, progressive in education. Now here is a map of where the fire began. Fire began here, right in around this area, and here's the Armenian cathedral here. You can see that it was set all around these areas and spread inward toward the sea, so that between September 13th and September 15th, the entire city had burned. In the Gulf of Smyrna were American vessels, British vessels, French vessels, Greek war vessels, whom the Greeks thought were their allies. But by that time, by 1922, the Allied powers were already shifting their strategies and policies and realizing that they could not defeat Mustafa Kemal unless they were willing to commit armies, and they were not willing to commit armies after World War I. There was already fatigue, exhaustion, demobilization was being demanded, and so while they were willing to support the Greek army in its expansion into Asia Minor, they were not willing themselves to do anything. And so by 1922, this same man, diplomat who had encouraged Venizelos, David Lloyd George, now switches and declares that his country is neutral. It's not getting engaged in this conflict between the Greeks and the Turks. And this attitude of neutrality is followed by other countries as well, including the United States. So that when the fire approaches the quay in September 14th, and there's in this very narrow area, these thousands of people are shoved together, including the Armenians who have now left their quarter because it's burning. And they start jumping into the water and swimming out to the Allied vessels, which are only a quarter of a mile or less than a quarter mile away. They are denied shelter, they're in a haven. They even have hoses that are turned on them to drop them back into the water. American and British eyewitnesses have painted a very, what shall I say, graphic picture of what was going on. The mutilation, the killing, the bodies everywhere. And the irony of it was that when the sailors on the SS Ironsides got troubled by the screeches and screams from the shore, the captain of the ship ordered that the ship's band come out and start playing loud military music, martial music, to drown out the sound of the victims. And the other sailor says the strangest thing that he'd ever seen is that the other ships, the other Allied ships in the bay, also began playing, their bands began playing so that the sailors would not become so upset. After a day, the Allied ships got orders that they could now begin to receive or take aboard refugees. And over the next day or two, several thousand Christian refugees, exiles or victims, were able to be taken aboard a ship and then transported eventually to either the Greek islands, which are right next door. You know, the first Greek island is like 3 miles from the coast of Chesme, or to Cyprus or to Piraeus. But what about the 100 to 200,000 others that are there? Well, after 2 days, an agreement was reached with Mustafa Kemal. Kemal was not like the Young Turks in that his objective was not the annihilation of the minority populations. His objective was to get rid of them, to cleanse the country, and not to commit genocide, but to cleanse them. And there were massacres that took place, but basically he wanted to get rid of them, to make Turkey more homogeneous. And therefore he allowed 30 days for the Allied vessels and the Greek Navy to come into Smyrna and to take aboard as many of the refugees as possible, and they most of them ended up in the Greek mainland. If you go to Greece today, you'll find many places that are known as, start out with Neo or Nea, New, something, or Nea Smyrna or Nea or something. These were people who were miserable, you know. In 1922 and 1923, there was then a forcible exchange of the Greek populations from all of Turkey, except Constantinople or Istanbul, and the Muslim population of Greece, a forced exchange in which about 1.25 million Christian Greeks were forcibly uprooted and sent to the Greek homeland, where they never felt themselves at home and always unhappy. And about 300,000 to 400,000 Muslims were transported from Greece to come back to Asia Minor to take their place. This process took place in 1923, primarily after the Treaty of Lausanne, which was a new treaty that regulated the boundaries of what is today largely the boundaries of today's Turkey and Middle Eastern countries. But there were thousands of young men, both Greek and Armenian, who were held hostage and were taken inland, much like the Armenians had been taken inland in 1915, as hostages, where they worked, and a very high mortality rate among them, until eventually they were released as well and made their way back to Greece. So with this action, this thriving, vibrant community of Armenians, and I'm focusing on Armenians because the Greek story is even larger and more tragic, if you will, because the Armenians were never more than a significant but not so important element of the city, but in Armenian history, very critical and very important community with its surroundings, was brought to a very abrupt end with these actions. Let me just show you, here's the fire. It started, it was enormous. A British commander who was seeing it, saying it was something like horrifyingly spectacular. I mean, you can imagine seeing the whole city burning at night, how beautiful that must be. You know, we like fireworks. It's more than fireworks, okay. And the city burning, and these are taken from Allied vessels. After the fire, this is the sports club, which was frequented by Levantines, Greeks, and Armenians before and after the fire. The American consulate was manned by a named George Horton. The American consul has written a whole book about Smyrna and the destruction of Smyrna. And you can see the American consulate before September 1915 and after September 1915. The Greek Orthodox Metropolitan of Smyrna was warned. He was a nationalist. He supported the Greek occupation of Smyrna and its expansion. He was warned to leave the city with the Greek army, but refused to do so. He said he would stay with his people, and became the first victim, really, of the vengeance, because he was mutilated and tortured to death upon by the mobs after the entry. And here you see the refugees. You see the American flag at the bottom of this here, and the refugees here. And the city burned out. And it remained burned out for a few years until a new program of rebuilding. And then it was laid out as a beautiful city, with no trace of the old city. That is, when I go to Smyrna or Izmir and look for any of these old streets that I recognize historically, you can't find them because the city has been laid out entirely with a new plan, and it's become, again, very modern, a beautiful city. And here you can see Smyrna, Izmir today without its Christian population. And in the background, you'll see the Hilton Hotel that is built right where the Armenian quarter had been, the high notes had been. And again, Smyrna, or Izmir. I have to get used to that. A beautiful city. Now, we come to the question of who burned Smyrna. If you go to a Turkish school for all these years, you will have been taught, and you're still being taught, that it was Armenian arsons or Greek arsons who burned the city, because they did not want their wealth to fall into the hands of the conquerors or the victorious Turks. Well, I mean, that's a logical explanation. So that's the Turkish state narrative, and it has support. It has support from the American High Commissioner in Constantinople or Istanbul, whose name was Admiral Mark Bristol, an individual who had no use for Greeks or Armenians or Jews, who believed in maintaining the Ottoman Empire as a whole, who was interested in economic expansion and open door policy of the United States. And so he agreed, although he wasn't there, he wrote many, many reports to Washington saying that the Turks were not responsible. This was, again, either the Armenians and Greeks. There were also a French commission that came out and said the Turks are not responsible. Of course, this is exactly at the time the French are also signing a treaty with Mustafa Kemal and giving up the region of Smyrna, not Smyrna, but Cilicia, which had been occupied by the French armies in 1920 and 21. Now the French government is giving up this area, and a couple of French admirals again said, there's no evidence that the Turks are responsible for this. So it's controversial. On the other hand, George Horton, who's the American consul, and is sitting there and watching from his office because it's right downtown near the seacoast, is seeing with his own eyes the Turkish officers going in and out of the Armenian quarter with lighted torches and coming out and seeing the place go up. And this is also true of Millie Mills, who is the headmistress of an American school in Smyrna, which also burned, and she says both she and her students witnessed uniformed Turkish soldiers going into the Armenian homes and igniting the fires. Now, if you want to find a counter to that, you can always find explanations, and one of the explanations that would be given by the Turkish narrative is that those were really Armenians who dressed up like Turkish soldiers and entered to disguise what they were doing. So this controversy has gone on for many years. There's a Turkish state narrative. There is a victim or Greek-Armenian narrative that says the open, and it's a good lesson about how do you solve these historical controversies when you can make good sense out of either interpretation, any interpretation. I'm going to end with, hold on 1 minute, with an interpretation given by a Turkish sociologist whose name is, I'll have to check it. She did a PhD here in New York State about room, like living space and living room. And her dissertation was about Smyrna, or Izmir. And she wrote an article in English about forgetting the Great Fire. She did extensive interviews with aged Turkish soldiers who were there, and also with residents there who have a memory passed down through them from their parents. She came to the conclusion, in her mind, and based on her research, that it was very definitely the Turkish army and Mustafa Kemal who wanted Smyrna to burn. Her name is Biray Kırlı. Kırlı is at Boğaziçi University, the used to be Robert College in Istanbul. And she makes these two statements, which again seem logical and point to the modern period. She said, I will argue that symbolically, the Great Fire was an act of punishment, a destruction aiming to purify, to chastise this gavur infidel city. At the same time, I argue, the destruction of the city through fire was an act of creation, an attempt to build places of counter-memory, opening up a terrain upon which the new nation's imprint, its Muslim and Turkish identity, could be carved and its cosmopolitanism nationalized. She continues, with a horrific appropriateness, the fire expressed in symbolic terms the rooting out and destruction of Greek and Armenian Smyrna. Hellenic Smyrna was dead. Christian Smyrna, too, one of the great ancient foundations of Asia Minor, was dead. The phoenix to rise from these ashes was a Turkish Izmir, purged of 2,000 years and more of history. And her interpretation is that symbolically, the burning of Smyrna was the act of creation in that it destroyed the multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multicultural Ottoman Empire, to which great weakness had been ascribed in later phases of the Ottoman Empire. And in its place, with the phoenix, instead of this whatever it may be, to create the homogeneous state of a Turkish Muslim national state. You may accept it, you may reject it, but it sort of sounds logical to me and true. I want to conclude with two things. First, on the 90th anniversary of the Great Fire, a well-known descendant of a Greek family of Smyrna put out a very moving dirge that some of you may have seen, but it has live footage of the fire, and it gives you a sense of that spectacular fire that burned day and night for 2.5 days, and the whole city in congregation. And so let's see that. Then I'll come back with my final comment. Maybe the lights need to be lowered a bit. So you can see how emotional an issue it remains for the descendants. I want to go back and maybe end on a upbeat note. And that is, when I first went to Izmir a few years ago, I had heard that in the town of Menemen, which is about a half hour north of Izmir, there still stood a Greek and an Armenian church. And on the last day there with my wife, I said, let's go and try to find it. And we had no idea how to find it. And we took one of these Turkish joint taxis, the dolmuş, you know, these, what do we call them? You know, where it goes on a particular route and you get on and off as you, a service, as they call it in Lebanon. Going northward toward Menemen, I had no idea where I was going, but I just had an instinct. You know, it makes me a believer. So I told the driver, "Dur, stop." He let us off, and we walked over the bridge over the highway, and within 100 yards we had come to the Armenian church of Saint Sergius, still standing. And let's have the next slide. Oh, I have the next slide. I think. What did I do with it? Do I have it? Yeah, could you forward it? Here is the Armenian church of Menemen. It's still standing, though. Of course, the Armenians are gone. And the good news is follows. Even though it's, let's go to the next one. Here you see the interior, a really run down, a refuse on the ground, etc. The good news is that the city of Menemen has declared it a historical monument. And along with the Greek church, which is a smaller church in Menemen, and to be renovated, I think, by UNESCO or American, European Union money. So maybe, you know, maybe when we talk about memory and counter-memory, maybe the restoration of a few churches will help to give us a little memory of what had been Smyrna, now Izmir, and perhaps also a little window opening for changing the state narrative that has been so intense all these years. Thank you very much. There are 2 copies of the Smyrna book in back if anyone is interested.
Richard, you'll answer some questions?
Yeah, if there are.
So if you have questions, Richard can field his own questions. Go ahead.
Could you talk a little bit about Greek-Armenian relations? You kind of conflated the two in the talk.
Greek-Armenian relations have, today Greeks and Armenians feel very close to one another because they both feel like they're common victims. Historically, they've been competitors. Historically, they have not always gotten along very well for their religious differences between the Orthodox faith and the Armenian Apostolic faith. They're also in the same, you know, when you're a competitor in the marketplace there, and a part also of, it may have been the policy of the Ottoman authorities to have an Armenian patriarch and a Greek Orthodox patriarch to sort of balance one another off. So they've been competitors. They, after World War I, they tried to join together and represent Christian concerns to the Western powers, but each has really done its own thing. Nonetheless, on a popular level, whether it's in the United States, Greece, or whatever, today, not only do they share this sense of common victimhood and anger, frustration, but as you well know, they share, like all the peoples of the region, the music, the cuisine, and many other things that endears themselves to one another. When an Armenian girl marries a Greek boy, it's okay. You know, it's close enough that it's all right, right? You know, my what is it, the big fat Greek wedding or something like that, right? Yeah, yes.
Richard, what happened to the debt on the ones that died in Smyrna, are there cemeteries?
Nothing. No.
Were the dead expatriated?
No, they were dumped. They were dumped into the ocean.
They were
Dumped into the sea. Yeah, dumped into the sea. There are no Christian cemeteries. Ironically, the Jewish quarter was spared, and the Turkish quarter was spared. The fire did not go, which they're next to each other, and they're on the other side of the Kasaba railway, the railway that goes to Kasaba. So those two quarters were spared, and of course it makes some Armenians and Greeks suspicious as to why was that quarter spared, and for political reasons. But no, they were simply disposed of. There was no cemetery. Anything else? Yes.
I heard that in the harbor, among the ships that were present, were also Japanese ships.
I think there was. I think I've heard that as well.
The only people who allowed
Yeah.
the Greeks
Right.
to get there were the Japanese.
I
Even though the others who cut
I think you're right. Yes. Because Japan was a part of the Allied powers at the time, so they would have had probably no more than one ship or maybe two. But yes. That, as I say, that was the first day, the very critical first day. And then the second day, they got orders that they could start to help the victims in the water. Right. Yes.
I like very much the way you concluded with the sociologist, and because that makes it a bigger story, right? So here's a really terrible event, and a rather vicious event. Nobody comes out well on this, and if you put it in the context as you did, of the Greek invasion and of the atrocities they actually committed, Greeks committed as they moved toward Ankara, then you can see this is really this is the sort of ugly underbelly of nation making that people have.
Well, yeah, that's why I call it ethnic cleansing in the process of nation building, as understood modern nation state of Turkey, the Republic of Turkey. Republic of Turkey would not be the Republic of Turkey with all those minorities and in their role. There's also this huge economic transfer of power. The Armenian and Greeks dominated the marketplace in city after city, town after town, port after port. And a part of the Young Turks before Kemal economic objectives, was to create a Turkish bourgeoisie to replace the Greeks. And they even called, even before 1914, for a boycott of Christian stores and shops of the population to weaken the economic stranglehold, if you want, from the Turkish point of view, economic stranglehold that the Christian minorities and the Jews held on the economy. So that any of these great upheavals, whether it's the genocide of the Armenians or whether it's the ethnic cleansing and the war that takes place, is accompanied by massive transfer of economic power and wealth from one group to another group. And I think that's true of every genocide that has occurred in the 20th century. Yeah.
I would add to that the irony is, so they wanted to create a Turkish bourgeoisie, and by the genocide particularly, but also the population exchange, they eliminated what you could call civil society.
Yes.
And therefore, when they had to build up a new Turkey, they had to do it through the state. And then you get this, hypertrophic state, this great state. And it's only till the 1960s and 70s that the Turks actually, modern Turkey, which is now a very developed and prosperous state, actually has its own bourgeoisie. The Sabancıs and all those people did take Armenian property,
They did indeed.
And but it took them, generations to build their own bourgeoisie.
Well, if you're a Kemalist, you'll say it's worth it. It's worth it.
Or Zionists.
Yeah. Thank you very much. All right.